The relentless precipitation hammered against the sullied transparisteel of the derelict sanctuary, forging an unsettling rhythm that mirrored Kalen Rourke's pulse. His combat weave, typically a streamlined testament to Zidonian ingenuity, was now marred and frayed. The energy sidearm in his grasp felt leaden, its charge indicator displaying a disheartening null. Emerge, emerge, wherever you may be, a voice, rich with velvet undertones, echoed from the ambient obscurity. I assure you it shall be swift, my dear. Kalen pressed his frame against the partition, his augmented auditory sensors detecting the faint footfalls of his enduring adversary, Lyra Valerius. The most lethal operative of the Celestial Concordat, her notoriety for ruthless precision was rivaled solely by her captivating allure, which she employed with a lethality akin to any plasma blade. You are aware, he projected, attempting to obscure his location, for one purported to be the preeminent executioner in 3 stellar clusters, your marksmanship is remarkably wanting. A melodious peal of laughter resonated through the murk. Says the operative who expended an entire charge pack on my spectral decoy. Kalen cursed beneath his breath. She was correct. He had squandered his energy on a deception that any novice should have recognized. Yet, something about Lyra invariably caused him to falter. Perhaps it was those penetrating sapphire optics, or the manner in which her cerulean complexion seemed to luminesce in the dimness. He shook his cranial unit, compelling himself to concentrate. The Terran Confederacy had not invested years in his cultivation merely for him to be beguiled by an attractive countenance, even if that countenance belonged to the most entrancing individual he had ever encountered. The Concordat must be growing desperate, he taunted, shifting gradually along the partition, dispatching their paramount operative after insignificant me. I am honored. Oh, my dear, her voice was nearer now, you should be. Do you comprehend the lengths I traversed to secure this commission? All others coveted it, yet I was insistent. A hiatus, succeeded by the tap of elevated footwear upon the wooden flooring. After all, we possess such a distinct rapport. Kalen felt his pulse accelerate. Their rapport encompassed 3 cycles of pursuit and evasion across the stellar expanse, each confrontation more fervent than the last. They had clashed aboard opulent starliners, within zero-gravity installations, and once, memorably, amidst a formal reception on Neoterra. Each time, they had departed with naught but contusions and an amplified yearning to outwit the other. Distinct, he scoffed. Is that your term for endeavoring to terminate me on Xylos Prime? You initiated hostilities on Cygnus 7, she retorted. That detonation nearly despoiled my favorite attire. It was a strategic imperative. It was ostentatious, he couldn't suppress a grin. Even amidst a mortal confrontation, their repartee felt instinctive, almost pleasurable. It was likely the reason they both remained extant. Neither had ever quite succeeded in delivering that ultimate fatal strike. The atmospheric discharge crackled outside, illuminating the chamber for a fleeting instant. In that transient gleam, Kalen glimpsed a lithe silhouette shifting behind a dilapidated divan. Without deliberation, he surged forward, grappling with Lyra precisely as she elevated her own depleted weapon. They collided with the divan in a jumble of appendages, the antiquated furnishing groaning beneath their aggregate mass. Kalen discovered himself atop her, immobilizing her arms above her head. Her sable attire had ridden up, revealing more of her azure-tinged dermis than he had ever witnessed. Captured you, he exhaled, striving to disregard how flawlessly she conformed beneath him. Lyra's sapphire optics sparkled with roguery. Do you truly believe so? Before he could react, she enfolded her legs around his midsection and inverted them. The divan ultimately yielded, collapsing under the abrupt maneuver. They tumbled onto the floor, neither willing to relinquish their hold, neither willing to concede. You are aware, she gasped, now astride him, there exist alternate methods to resolve this. Kalen gazed up at her, absorbing her disheveled indigo tresses, the blush upon her exotic features, the manner in which her thoracic cavity heaved with each respiration. What did you envision? Her response arrived in the form of a kiss that tasted of peril and predestination. The initial rays of the binary suns permeated through the fractured transparisteel of the sanctuary, casting elongated shadows across the floor. Kalen lay vigilant upon the battered divan, his combat weave discarded nearby, observing Lyra's serene, slumbering form beside him. Her azure dermis seemed to incandesce in the nascent light, her lengthy lapis lazuli hair cascading over her unclothed shoulders. The preceding nocturne had been unforeseen. Years of tension, of pursuit and evasion, had ultimately erupted into something primordial and profound. He had been intimate with Terran females previously, yet nothing had prepared him for the fervor of being with Lyra. Every caress, every osculation, had felt akin to a miniature stellar conflagration. She stirred beside him, her sapphire optics fluttering open. For a fleeting moment, they merely gazed at one another, neither desiring to shatter the enchantment of the instant. "You remain," she murmured, reaching out to trace the cicatrix upon his pectoral region, a memento from their encounter on Cygnus 7. "As do you," he responded, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her metacarpus. "I half anticipated you would endeavor to terminate me in my slumber." She laughed, the sound opulent and melodious. "The nocturne is not yet concluded, my dear." Yet, there was something altered in her intonation now, a warmth that had been absent previously. The lethal executioner had been supplanted by something softer, more susceptible. Kalen discovered himself pondering if this was the authentic Lyra, the one concealed beneath years of indoctrination and conditioning. "You know," he said, propping himself up on one elbow, "I never inquired why you aligned yourself with the Concordat." She remained silent for a protracted interval, her digits absently tracing patterns upon his dermis. "The same rationale you aligned yourself with the Confederacy, I presume. We all serve something surpassing ourselves." She paused, a shadow traversing her countenance. "Though of late, I have been contemplating whether that which we serve warrants the forfeiture we render." Kalen comprehended. He had been harboring analogous contemplations. The interstellar cold conflict had been raging for decades, with both factions asserting the ethical high ground while perpetrating atrocities in the shadows. He and Lyra were merely pawns in a vastly grander game. "What transpires now?" he inquired, voicing the query they had both been circumventing. Lyra sat up, the sheet cascading away to reveal more of her exotic pulchritude. "Now, we feign that this never occurred. We revert to our respective factions, back to endeavoring to terminate one another." But her voice lacked conviction. "Is that your desire?" She turned to gaze at him, her sapphire optics inscrutable. "My desires ceased to matter a protracted duration ago, Kalen. We both possess our obligations." He reached for her, drawing her back down beside him. "Perhaps it is time we recommenced desiring things anew." She did not resist, melting into his embrace with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of galaxies. "You Terrans," she murmured against his pectoral region, "invariably so impassioned, so convinced you can alter the cosmos through sheer force of volition. Is that a grievance?" "An observation." She lifted her head to meet his gaze. "Your species intrigues me. You are so nascent compared to the remainder of us, yet you incandesce so brilliantly. You love with your entirety of hearts, contend with your entirety of souls. It is intoxicating." Kalen grinned. "Intoxicating sufficiently to render you oblivious to obligation for a while longer?" Her response arrived in the form of a kiss that tasted of stardust and impossibility. Time seemed to decelerate as they lost themselves in one another anew, their bodies moving together with a grace that defied their customary violent confrontations. Later, as they lay entwined in each other's arms, Lyra spoke softly, "This alters everything, does it not?" "Only if we permit it," Kalen responded, though he knew it already had. Something fundamental had shifted between them, something that could not be undone. The morning luminescence grew stronger, reality commencing to intrude upon their secluded universe. Soon, they would be compelled to confront the ramifications of their actions. Their respective agencies would be seeking them, anticipating reports, outcomes. "I should depart," Lyra stated finally, though she made no maneuver to leave. Kalen tightened his arms around her. "Remain." She laughed softly. "And what would we accomplish? Abscond together? Become interstellar marauders? Why not? I have invariably yearned to be a dashing rogue." "You are preposterous," she said, but her smile was affectionate. "Then, that is not a negation." She sat up anew, this time with determination. "Kalen," her voice was gentle but resolute, "we both comprehend this cannot endure. Our spheres are excessively disparate. Our allegiances are excessively deeply ingrained." He observed as she commenced gathering her attire, each movement graceful despite the lingering effects of their passion. Her sable attire was creased beyond restoration, but somehow, she rendered it appear elegant nonetheless. "It does not have to be this manner," he stated, even though he knew she was correct. She paused in the act of adjusting her hair, her expression softening. In an alternate existence, perhaps. But in this one. She leaned down to kiss him one final instance, a kiss that tasted of farewell. Gratitude for demonstrating to me that Terrans are not the sole entities who can incandesce brightly. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving naught but the lingering aroma of her dermis and the recollection of her touch. Kalen lay there for a protracted duration, observing the binary suns ascend higher in the alien firmament, pondering if he would ever see her anew. He did not comprehend it yet, but their narrative was far from concluded. 3 lunar cycles had elapsed since that night in the derelict sanctuary. Kalen sat in a dimly illuminated tavern on Neo Singapore Station, nursing a chalice of Terran-fermented grain while monitoring his latest quarry. The colossal space station, a neutral nexus for both Confederacy and Concordat operatives, thrummed with its customary undercurrent of subterfuge and peril. His combat weave sensors detected a familiar biosignature moments before he caught her scent, a blend of exotic flora and something uniquely alien. His pulse quickened as Lyra glided into the seat across from him, attired in a form-fitting argent gown that complemented her azure complexion flawlessly. Of all the liquor establishments in all the stellar expanse, he drawled, attempting to mask how her presence affected him. Spare me the archaic Terran illusions, my dear, her voice was taut, lacking its customary playful edge. We necessitate discourse. Kalen studied her countenance, noting subtle alterations. Her sapphire optics seemed more luminous than usual, and there was a faint flush to her azure cheeks that he had never noticed previously. I am occupied. Your target departed 10 chronocycles prior with a Centaurian ordnance broker. She waved dismissively. This possesses greater import. He leaned back, intrigued. In their years of pursuit and evasion, Lyra had never sought him out directly. I am attentive. She glanced around the tavern, then leaned forward. Not here. Convene with me in Hangar Bay 47 in 20 chronocycles.
Arrive une accompagnée.
Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving only the lingering trace of her perfume and 1,000 queries in her wake. 20 chronocycles later, Kalen discovered himself in a deserted hangar bay, his hand resting casually upon his energy sidearm. The massive viewport showcased the glittering expanse of interstellar space, Neoterra's luminescence twinkling in the distance. You can disarm, Lyra's voice echoed from behind a stack of cargo modules. If I desired your demise, I would not have troubled with a melodramatic rendezvous arrangement. She stepped into view, and Kalen immediately noticed something different about her locomotion, a faint hesitation, a cautious grace that supplanted her customary predatory stalking. What is amiss? He inquired, genuine concern coloring his voice. Lyra took a deep inhalation, her hands clasped before her. I am, with child. The words hung in the recycled station air like suspended particles of stellar debris. Kalen felt the deck shift beneath his feet, though he knew the station's artificial gravity was functioning flawlessly. That is unfeasible, he managed. The genetic disparities. Evidently, she interrupted him, Terrans are more congruent with my species than anyone comprehended. Our savants have been quite captivated by the development. Kalen's mind raced. Your savants. The Concordat is cognizant? Not presently, she placed a hand protectively over her still flat abdomen. I possess, associates who have assisted me in maintaining this clandestine. But I shall not be capable of concealing it much longer. He took a step toward her, then halted, uncertain of his welcome. Why inform me? Lyra's laugh was devoid of mirth. Because you are the progenitor. Because this offspring signifies something unprecedented in stellar history. Because I have not been capable of ceasing my contemplations of you since that nocturne. She shook her head. Select your rationale. Kalen closed the distance between them, his hand reaching out to touch her countenance. She did not recoil. I have not ceased my contemplations of you either. This alters everything, she whispered, echoing their words from that morning after. It already has, he drew her closer, feeling her tremble slightly. What is your desired course of action? I do not know, her voice was diminished, vulnerable in a manner he had never heard previously. The Concordat, they will desire to scrutinize the child. They will perceive it as a weapon, a means to comprehend Terran genetic advantages. And the Confederacy will not be any superior, Kalen added grimly. They will desire to comprehend how this is feasible, how to replicate it. We could abscond, Lyra suggested, but there was no conviction in her voice. They both knew better. In a stellar expanse bifurcated between two superpowers, there was nowhere to conceal oneself indefinitely. Or we could remain and contend, Kaelin said, an idea forming. Employ our positions to safeguard our offspring. Manipulate both factions against the center. She drew back slightly to gaze at him. That is self-destructive. Perhaps. But we are both adept at unfeasible missions, he smiled.
And now, vi possesso meting meriting contention.
Lyra's hand found his, guiding it to her abdomen. Though there was no external indication yet, Kaelin felt something, a connection, a possibility, a futurity he had never envisioned for himself. The timing could not be more unfavorable, she murmured. The cold conflict is escalating. Both factions are preparing for overt hostilities. Then we must operate more expeditiously, he drew her close once more, inhaling her familiar scent. We have expended years endeavoring to terminate one another. Perhaps it is time we endeavored to preserve one another instead. She laughed softly against his pectoral region. You Terrans and your idyllic notions.
You adore it.
Conceivably, I do, she lifted her countenance to his. This will not be facile.
Noting meriting possession eva is.
He kissed her then, a kiss replete with promise and resolution. When they finally parted, Lyra's sapphire optics were shining with unshed tears.
I muss depart.
I have congregations, appearances to sustain. But Kaelin, she touched his countenance gently, whatever transpires, comprehend that you have bestowed upon me something I never conceived feasible, a neonate optimism. She smiled, and it was akin to witnessing a stellar body's genesis. You have bestowed upon me optimism as well. As she turned to leave, Kaelin called after her, How shall I locate you? She glanced back over her shoulder, her azure hair catching the starlight. You shall not be compelled to. I shall locate you when it is time.
The Opulenzsuite on Vega Prime's most exclusive orbital resort shimmered with artificial starlight.
Kaelin adjusted his formal attire, a stark contrast to his usual combat weave, as he prepared for another meticulously orchestrated confrontation with Lyra. Their new game of deception required regular public encounters to maintain their cover as bitter rivals. The door chimed, precisely on schedule. Lyra swept in, wearing a shimmering gown that accentuated her burgeoning curves while cleverly concealing her 4-month gestation. Her sapphire eyes danced with mischief as she took in his appearance. My Agent Rourke, she purred, circling him like a predator. You refine rather admirably for a Terran. And you are as inconspicuous as a supernova, Agent Valerius, he smirked, knowing the suite was being monitored.
Come to terminate me anef.
Oh darling, she drew closer, her fingers trailing across his chest. If I desired your demise, you would not perceive my approach. Their elaborate dance had become a masterwork of misdirection. Every encounter was a performance, every touch a carefully calculated maneuver in their grand deception. The Confederacy and Concordat surveillance teams observing them would perceive only their customary lethal flirtation, never suspecting the verity behind their rivalry. Your latest intelligence report was quite intriguing, Kaelin murmured, capturing her hand. The Concordat must be desperate to disseminate such sensitive information. Careful, she breathed against his ear, you are presuming it was veracious. They moved together in a deadly waltz of whispered half-truths and calculated revelations. Each fragment of information they fed their respective agencies was a blend of verity and fabrication, designed to keep both factions pursuing shadows while they prepared for their child's arrival. The Confederacy is mobilizing in the Orion sector, he said, loud enough for the listening devices to detect. And the Concordat possesses spies in the Centauri system, she countered, her fingers intertwining with his. Their bodies pressed closer, the pretense of combat becoming something else entirely. The chemistry between them remained explosive, their attraction magnified by the perilous game they played. We should relocate this somewhere more secluded, Lyra suggested, her voice carrying just the right note of seductive menace. Kaelin activated his signal scrambler, creating a momentary blind spot in the surveillance. They slipped through a concealed portal into a secure chamber he had prepared earlier, their public personas falling away like shed armor the instant they were alone. Lyra's confident facade cracked slightly. She pressed a hand to her stomach, exhaling slowly. Are you well? Kaelin moved to support her, genuine concern replacing their theatrical antagonism. Your child, she said, with a mixture of wonder and exasperation, possesses your energy levels. He never ceases motion. Kalen's heart skipped a beat.
You can discern?
My species can sense certain facets concerning their progeny, she guided his hand to her belly. He possesses your fortitude, your fervor, and my aptitude for driving his progenitors to distraction. The moment was interrupted by a soft beep from Kalen's secure communicator. The Confederacy accepted our latest exchange, he reported, reading the message. They are redirecting assets to investigate the Centauri lead. Excellent. Lyra settled onto a plush couch, her professional mask slipping further. The Concordat is equally preoccupied. My handler actually commended me on extracting the Orion intelligence from you. Kalen sat beside her, pulling her close. How much longer can we sustain this? Sufficiently prolonged, she nestled against him, her body conforming perfectly against his. My contacts within the medical community are preparing everything we require. When the time arrives, we shall be prepared. Their lips met in a kiss that held none of their public pretense, only the raw verity of their connection. The passion that had first brought them together flared anew, heightened by the peril of their situation and the miracle gestating between them. Later, as they lay entwined in the sheets of the secure chamber's bed, Lyra traced the new scars on Kalen's chest, real ones earned in service of their deception. Occasionally, she murmured, I ponder what would have transpired if we had met under disparate circumstances, if we were not who we are. We would not be us, he replied, running his fingers through her azure hair. It is the peril that brought us together, the rivalry that rendered us perceive one another distinctly. She laughed softly. Trust a Terran to discover romance in attempted homicide. Trust an alien to succumb to her quarry. Their playful banter was interrupted by another secure message. Lyra read it over Kalen's shoulder, her body tensing. The Concordat is orchestrating something significant, she said, her professional instincts taking over. These troop deployments, they are not merely exercises. Kalen studied the data, his tactical mind analyzing patterns. The Confederacy is responding in kind. The cold conflict is escalating more rapidly than we anticipated. We necessitate accelerating our timeline, Lyra stood, her nude form silhouetted against the artificial starlight. I cannot be with child amidst overt hostilities. Agreed, Kalen joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. I possess a sanctuary on Xylos Prime. It is completely off both agencies' radar. Xylos Prime. She turned in his embrace, an eyebrow raised. Where you endeavored to terminate me 2 cycles prior? Where you succumbed to my allure, he corrected with a grin. Presumptuous Terran. But she was smiling. It could function. The radiation fields there interfere with long-range scanning. We could vanish for a few weeks without arousing suspicions. Then that is our stratagem, he kissed her deeply, pouring all his commitment and resolution into the gesture. We will necessitate sustaining our cover until then, continuing to feed both factions just sufficient to maintain their distraction. Speaking of which, Lyra glanced at the chronometer display. We should revert to our performance. I believe I was in the midst of endeavoring to assassinate you. Correct. Kalen began gathering his attire. Should I hemorrhage this time, or will a few contusions suffice to sell the narrative? Surprise me, she slipped back into her gown with practiced grace. Just recall. I comprehend, not the countenance. Their laughter, genuine and intimate, faded as they reassumed their public personas. The game would continue, but now with heightened stakes and a clearer purpose. Their child's futurity hinged on their capacity to sustain this elaborate deception just a little longer.